Thank you all for being with us. It's a very special occasion, the annual Robert Wood Lecture. It's really an annual important passage for all of us at the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, and we're thrilled that you could join us tonight for a very special lecture. At the outset, let me acknowledge the Wood family, Peggy Wood, Franny Wood, and daughter Maggie Hassan. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for sharing your husband and your dad with what had been the McCormack Institute and now is the McCormack Graduate School. My name is Ira Jackson. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. Bob Wood, for whom this prestigious lectureship is named, was Secretary of HUD, President of UMass, Chairman of the T, Superintendent of the Boston Public School System, and a Senior Fellow of the McCormack Institute, among many other distinctions. He was a well-known author, a serious intellectual, Chairman of the Political Science Department at MIT, a professor at Wesleyan, and head of the Harvard-MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies. He combined the head of an intellectual with the heart of a dreamer and the hands of a doer. He represented the best of what we try to advance at the McCormack Graduate School every day, both theory and practice. If Bob were alive today, I think he'd be pleased to know how this particular institution, which he was so proud of, has recently prospered, in part under the leadership of Keith Motley, and importantly under the intellectual leadership of our provost, Winston Langley, who joins us tonight. Where are you, Winston? Let me offer just 5 examples of ways in which UMass Boston and McCormack are coming of age. First, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. 40 years after Bob Wood oversaw our move from Park Square to Columbia Point, we're rising and emerging as a substantial institution of higher education. No longer peripheral, UMass Boston has begun to take its rightful place in the spotlight as Boston's only public research university. Secondly, UMass Boston is fulfilling its role as the gateway to educational excellence and opportunity. There is no more diverse institution of higher education anywhere in New England. 57% of our students are the first in their families to attend college. 44% of them receive Pell Grants, which means they've grown up in poverty. They speak 92 different native languages at home, and our freshman class, the largest in the university's history, is this year a majority minority. As the current president of UMass, Robert Corrett, says, if you want to see the future, come to UMass Boston. Third, UMass Boston is innovating and leading. Our gerontology department at the McCormack Graduate School has produced 25% of all the PhDs in gerontology in the world. UMass Boston instituted the first PhD in green biology anywhere. Our School for Global Inclusion is the only one of its kind. And just last month, largely based on what we have achieved at the McCormack Graduate School, UMass Boston was ranked among the top 30 most innovative public service colleges in America. Fourth, just 3 weeks ago, President Obama, Vice President Biden, Senator McCain, Governor Baker, Mayor Walsh, and others joined us to dedicate the new Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, built on property alongside the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, which Bob Wood persuaded Jackie Kennedy Onassis to locate out here on Columbia Point 20 years ago. Just look at us now. As Vicki Kennedy is fond of saying, Columbia Point is suddenly the place to be. And finally, our work is making a difference, and our faculty increasingly are being recognized. The McCormack School's pioneering doctoral program in human security and global governance just accepted our 4th cohort of fabulously talented students from around the world. Our Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development played and continues to play a central role in Nigeria mediating between Christians and Muslims along the fault line that separates this largest and most important African nation. Our Gerontology Institute is working with Mayor Marty Walsh to make Boston the most age-friendly city in America, and our Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy is shaping an action agenda for women's economic security in the 6 New England states. Last week, we learned that one of our panelists responding to Professor Wilson's remarks tonight, Professor Mark Warren, will receive the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship to pursue his groundbreaking work on the school-to-prison pipeline and his call for a national educational justice movement. And tomorrow, we will all read in the New York Times that a McCormack Graduate School professor is one of only 31 recipients nationally of a new Carnegie Foundation Fellowship designed to assist public intellectuals to tackle wicked problems facing the world. So I sense that Bob Wood would be proud of his beloved UMass Boston and the institute he called home, now the McCormack Graduate School. But I know that Bob would be prouder still of his daughter, Maggie, the 81st governor of New Hampshire. A common sense reformer, a principled consensus builder, Governor Hassan has been a champion of both innovation and fiscal responsibility and has restored civility and bipartisanship to the Granite State. She had a busy weekend with what seemed like a scrum of Republican presidential hopefuls up there in Nashua, and we're delighted that she's here with us tonight in Boston to remember her dad and to offer us her gracious perspective. Maggie Hassan.
Well, good evening. And thank you, Ira, for that very gracious introduction. And yes, indeed, Dad would be so proud of this wonderful campus and, more importantly, what's happening at this wonderful campus. And I am grateful to be up here to speak a little bit about him and to welcome all of you on behalf of my mom and my sister and my brother, who is an actor in New York, so he never seems to be able to come because he's always either auditioning or performing, which is the life of an actor. I wanted just to take a minute to reflect with all of you on why my dad thought the world of public intellectualism was so important. Ira mentioned that Dad was a serious academic who also was quite a dreamer and a doer. I would say he was a public intellectual who was incredibly impatient when he saw a problem that needed to be fixed. And I think that speaks to the reality of what it means to take policy and actually make it work for people to further the mission that we have all agreed to undertake as members of a democracy, right? So I think a lot about the fact that my dad was not only a wonderful and skilled and insightful academic, but he brought to his intellectual work his life experience. Someone who grew up in the Deep South during the Jim Crow era, somebody whose family was vastly impacted by the Great Depression, somebody who served in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, and then came home determined to make his country a better place, and so grateful for everything he had survived. Those life experiences framed my dad's intellectual work. Luckily, he was married to my very brilliant mother, who every now and then made him actually do his intellectual work and prove his points, often at the dinner table, because he was often eager to get the policy into the pipeline and applied, right? And I think that that really speaks to the fact that, you know, you have policy on the one hand, you have people on the other, and you have politics right smack in the middle. And that's what Dad understood more than anything else. Your policy is no good if it can't be implemented in a way that has the kind of impacts that you're hoping for. So I hope for all of the students and the faculty and the visitors who are here, you will keep that in mind. The American mission, started by a group of visionaries who said the words that everybody counts, but then didn't count everybody, had the confidence to believe that each generation of Americans would address the mission afresh, and they would do that by gradually moving people who were disenfranchised, who were on the margins, into the heart and soul of community. And they knew that when we did that, we would make better and better decisions, because as all of you who have done the research know, when you have more perspectives at the decision-making table, you in fact make better decisions. But our founders also understood that it wouldn't just be about making good decisions. It would be honoring human dignity, unleashing talent and energy, that would be a rightful end in its own right? But it would also make us stronger, grow an economy that was the result of those thriving human beings, and make us stronger in the end. So my dad had that perspective in everything he did, this notion that we needed to include more and more people, we needed to bring those experiences to the table, we needed to allow them to influence the policy we made, but also understand how they were influencing it, and then bring it to the people who could actually make the policy work, so that we would all get stronger and we would all thrive together. That's what the work of the McCormack Institute is all about. That's what the work of all of you who are doing good intellectual policy work is all about. And I am grateful to all of you for many things, but I am also grateful as a governor to know that there are resources among all of you that help me bring policy to people and make my state, and I hope my country, stronger. So thank you.
I hope it's not disrespectful to say that I don't think Maggie fell far from the tree. William Julius Wilson is the kind of public intellectual that Maggie just described, and kind of public intellectual that Bob Wood personified. William Julius Wilson is arguably the nation's leading urban sociologist. He is certainly one of the most important academics anywhere in the world on the subjects of race and class. After spending the first half of his very distinguished career at the University of Chicago, he joined the faculty at Harvard some 20 years ago, where he is now one of only 24 university professors. I hope you've received the program, and if not, we can circulate it around his profile and that of the panelists. I won't go on and on. His resume and vitae goes on for, I think, 47 pages. I was struck by the fact that he's the recipient of some 45 honorary degrees, a member of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, the author of a host of seminal books, and a MacArthur Genius Award recipient. He's a deeply thoughtful researcher and observer and teacher about the continuing challenge of race and class that challenge America's promise. And he must be one of the very few serious academics to ever inspire an HBO award-winning series. His book, When Work Disappears, is the basis of The Wire, and now the subject of a popular course for undergraduates at Harvard. William Julius Wilson is a voice that needs to be heard, respected, and listened to now more than ever. Let me express my gratitude to Bob Turner and the rest of the Robert Wood Committee for nominating Professor Wilson. We're delighted and honored that he has accepted our invitation to deliver our 2015 Robert Wood Lecture at the McCormack Graduate School and to deliver a keynote address entitled Reflections on Issues of Race and Class in the 21st Century, Revisiting Arguments Advanced in the Declining Significance of Race, first published in 1978, which I think is 5 years ago. Please join me in welcoming back to UMass Boston, Professor William Julius Wilson.
Thank you very much. It's indeed an honor to deliver a lecture in honor of Robert C. Wood, former president of the UMass system, to this august body, which includes the family of Robert C. Wood. As Ira pointed out, my lecture is entitled Reflections on the Issues of Race and Class in the 21st Century, Revisiting Arguments Advanced in the Declining Significance of Race, originally published in 1978. Now, the Journal of Racial and Ethnic Studies is publishing a symposium later this spring on my book, The Declining Significance of Race. And I had the opportunity to respond to several thoughtful reflections on the book 37 years after its initial publication. And I thought it would be more than appropriate to include in my presentation this evening parts of my rejoinder to the papers in that symposium. The title, The Declining Significance of Race, lends itself to misinterpretation among those who have either not read the book or not read it carefully. For such readers, as I pointed out in the book's third edition, the title conveys an optimistic view of American race relations and doesn't reflect the book's pessimistic tone about the conditions and future of poor blacks, which reminds me, Governor, that after the book was published, I was invited by Ronald Reagan's office to come to meet with the president. I got a call from one of his assistants saying, Professor Wilson, we're inviting you to come with other black conservatives to meet with the president. You know, they read the book, they saw the title, The Declining Significance of Race. And I said, where did you get the idea that I'm a black conservative? And they said, well, you're on the list. And I said, take me off that list. You know, as University of Miami sociologist George Wilson notes in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium, many of the studies whose title play off the phrase, the declining significance of race, do not even acknowledge or attempt to address the two major underlying themes of the book. One, the effect of fundamental economic and political shifts on the changing relative importance of race and class in the life trajectories of African Americans. And two, the swing in the concentration of racial conflict from the economic sector to the socio-political order. Now, in sharp contrast to many earlier studies, the articles in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium include a careful discussion of these two major themes. And I reflect on this discussion in my presentation today, which also relates the two major themes to more recent developments in American race and ethnic relations, featuring other groups, including whites and Latinos, as well as advance some thoughts on the future of race relations in the U.S. Several of the participants in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium highlight the declining significance of race's theoretical framework relating racial issues to the changing economic and political arrangements of society. As Harvard sociologist Matthew Desmond put it, quote, "The central thrust of the book has to do with the fundamental ways that large-scale transformations in economic and political institutions brought about the historic decoupling of race from class in the African American experience," unquote. Moreover, University of Michigan sociologist Karen Lacey highlights the book's historical analysis of the relationship between changing societal institutions and Black social mobility. And Texas A&M sociologist Arthur Sakamoto indicates that the declining significance of race identified emerging technological advances associated with communication and transportation, which have now become increasingly globalized and have an even more profound impact on low-skilled workers, including poor African American workers. The focus on economic transformations provides a backdrop for my analysis of the changing role of race and class in determining Black life chances. As George Wilson appropriately observed in the symposium, in the declining significance of race, occupational mobility and job placement are most directly related to life chances. And beginning in the last few decades of the 20th century, the economic and social conditions of the Black poor deteriorated, I argued in the book, while those of the Black middle class improved. Indeed, as Matthew Desmond emphasized in the symposium, in many respects, the conditions of poor African Americans are worse now than when the first edition of The Declining Significance of Race was published almost 4 decades ago. Now, in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium, political scientists Jennifer Hochschild of Harvard and Vesla Weaver of Yale provide a comprehensive discussion of the widening gap between the haves and have-nots in the Black community that lends support to this pessimistic conclusion. First of all, their analysis of data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress reveals that the test score disparity between Black and white students with well-educated parents was greater in 2012 than it had been in 1978 or 1980, leading to the conclusion that, quote, the educationally best off are becoming educationally better off at a faster rate than are the worst off who are stagnating or even losing ground, unquote. Second, they draw upon U.S. Census data using the Genie Ratio and demonstrate that income inequality is now greater among Blacks than any other group. And I examined the same source and present the findings here in Figure 1. Now, the Genie ratio measures the extent to which the actual income distribution of a particular group deviates from a hypothetical distribution in which each household of the group receives an equal proportion of total group income. The measure ranges from 0, perfect equality, to 1, maximum inequality. Now, this figure discloses the increasing household income inequality across the American population as a whole, rising from a low of 0.39, it's actually 0.394 in 1970, that blue line there, to 0.476 in 2013. So you see a rising line of inequality for all racial and ethnic groups. More important, however, is a high level of intra-group inequality among black households. Although the absolute level of black income is nowhere near as high as that of whites, blacks nonetheless display the most intra-group income inequality, reaching a household Gini index of 0.49 in 2013, followed by whites at 0.47 and Hispanics at 0.45. Now, research reveals, is that clear? Okay. Research reveals that income inequality is related to income segregation. This figure, figure 2, presents data on income segregation by race in metropolitan areas with populations of more than 500,000. Now, the source of this figure is a study by Kendra Bishop and Sean Reardon, a study to which Hochschild and Weaver referred to in a symposium on the declining significance of race. This figure reveals that income segregation has grown rapidly in the last decade, and particularly among black and Hispanic families. And what is notable is that whereas African American families in 1970, that purple line there, recorded the least income segregation. Look at that figure. 1970, they recorded the least income segregation. They now register the highest income segregation. Now, please note that we are talking here about residential segregation among black families of differing income levels, not segregation between black and white families. In other words, the line for black families represents the trend in residential segregation for families of different income levels, not the trend in segregation between black and white families. Now, another way of talking about this, another way of talking about these trend lines is that they describe the extent to which the exposure of families to neighbors of the same race has changed over time. Now, although income segregation among black families grew considerably in the 1970s and 1980s. It grew even more rapidly from 2000 to 2009, after slightly declining in the 1990s. And when considering a person's life trajectory or life chances, the differences in the quality of one's daily life between residing in a predominantly affluent neighborhood and a poor black neighborhood are huge. Poor black families have fewer middle-class neighbors today than they had in 1970. And when income segregation is coupled with racial segregation, low-income blacks cluster in neighborhoods that feature disadvantages along several dimensions, including joblessness, educational attainment, and family structure. On this point, Hochschild and Weaver state, quote, "To choose only one important indicator, in 1978, poor blacks aged 12 and over were only slightly more likely than comparable but better off blacks to be victims of violent crime, about 45 and 38 per 1,000 people respectively. By 2008, however, poor blacks were much more likely to be crime victims, about 75 per 1,000, while affluent blacks were much less likely to be crime victims, about 20 per 1,000. Now, how do we explain the rapid growth in income segregation among black families? Well, in the 1970s and 1980s, the rise of black family income segregation may have been related to changes in housing legislation and increased black suburbanization, as well as the rise of a more substantial black middle class, which is partly reflected in increased income inequality. However, according to Bischoff and Reardon, in another study, one cannot apply the same explanation to the accelerated growth of income segregation among black families in the 2000s, because there was no growth in metropolitan area income inequality among black families during that period, that is the 2000s. One possible explanation for the growth, they state, quote, is the lenient mortgage lending practices that were common in the early part of the 2000s. These practices provided many moderate income families with increased access to home ownership, and therefore may have increased the residential distance between low and middle income black families. Finally, Karen Lacey provides another perspective in support of the pessimistic conclusion that the condition of poor African Americans are worse now when the first edition of The Declining Significance of Race was published, reflecting on my argument in The Declining Significance of Race that economic and political systems in the United States have demonstrated remarkable flexibility in allowing talented blacks to fill positions of prestige and influence. At the same time, these systems have shown persistent rigidity in handling the problems of lower class blacks, unquote. This is from The Declining Significance of Race. Lacey points out, reflecting on that statement, that actions by the Supreme Court and federal and local governments in recent years have made it more difficult for the poor, including, of course, poor blacks, to improve or even maintain their social economic position. The power and negotiation position of labor unions have weakened. Calls to substantially raise the minimum wage, whose real dollar value has eroded during the past several decades, have been resisted. The criteria of welfare eligibility have toughened. Employment opportunities in the public sector have waned, and penalties for financial instability, including interest rates for excessive credit card debt, have become more severe. While institutions punish the poor for their poverty status, she states, quote, higher income people are rewarded for their success, unquote, as revealed in a dramatic decline in their earned income tax rates and capital gains tax. So, despite the continuing interracial disparities, as authors in this symposium indicate, the socioeconomic gap between better off blacks, including the college educated, and poor blacks is wide and growing. However, as I was telling students at lunch this afternoon, in order to keep things in proper perspective, it is important not to overlook the continuing interracial disparities. For example, a report from the Center for Economic and Policy Research reveals that before the Great Recession, there was only a 1.4 percentage point difference in the unemployment gap between recent black and white college graduates aged 22 to 27. However, in 2013, shortly after the economic downturn, the gap had surged to a 7.5 percentage difference. Now, race is obviously a factor at play because historically, the periods during and immediately after downturns have adversely impacted blacks more than whites. However, the issues involving race in these intergroup comparisons are complex. For example, aside from the role of racial discrimination, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges, and therefore have an edge when employers rely on such criteria, especially during slack labor markets, periods of high unemployment. Moreover, even though there has been greater income segregation among black families, middle-class blacks tend to live in neighborhoods with a higher percentage of low-income neighbors than do comparable white families. Indeed, low-income white families who are also affected by income segregation are more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher average incomes than black families, even middle-class black families. Racial differences in wealth help to explain some of these patterns, because white families have greater average wealth than black families. Because of this, they are more likely to afford housing in higher income neighborhoods. The Pew Research Center recently released data showing that the median financial wealth of a white household in 2012 exceeded that of a black household by almost $134,000. So despite the sharp increases in income inequality and income segregation among blacks, the interracial disparities between blacks and whites remain huge and must always be kept in mind when discussing and highlighting growing intra-racial differences. Now, as noted previously, one of the two major underlying themes of the declining significance of race is that the center of racial conflict tension had shifted from the economic sector to the socio-political order. I argued in the book that neither the low-wage sector nor the corporate and government sectors provide the basis for the sort of interracial job competition and conflict that beset the economic order in previous years. Today, I argued, racial tensions and conflicts have more to do with competition for and access to residential areas, public schools, and municipal political systems than with competition for jobs. Now, none of the authors in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Symposium take issue with these basic arguments. For example, Matthew Desmond of Harvard states, quote, "The declining significance of race also reaches beyond an economic determinist perspective by concluding that racial antagonism no longer is primarily a product of struggles over work and wages." Notice I said primarily. In that way, it anticipated the emergence of different institutions that would come to have profound influence on American race relations, unquote. And he cites studies that provide detailed discussions of these institutions and their impact on the African American community, including studies on the uneven distribution of concentrated disadvantage and violence in neighborhoods, the reproduction of racial inequality in public schools, the criminal justice system and its prisons, race and class conflict in municipal politics, techniques of resource extraction in housing markets, and the public sector's frayed safety net. Now, the arguments by the authors in this symposium make clear what is often overlooked or ignored in many of the studies that responded to the declining significance of race, namely that the book's original argument was not that race is no longer significant or that racial barriers between blacks and whites have been eliminated, rather in comparing the contemporary situation of African Americans to their situation in the past, the diverging experiences of blacks along class lines, and the shifting concentration of racial tension from the economic sector to the socio-political order indicate that race, although still very salient, has a lesser effect today than economic class in determining blacks' life trajectories. But does this argument apply to other racial groups? According to Sakamoto in the symposium, a careful reading of the declining significance of race shows that it, quote, foretells the rapid rise in class inequality that is now generally recognized to have become a major political issue, unquote. As Hochschild and Weber put it, quote, the significance of class is increasing in the United States in the sense that economic inequality is rising within the black and Latino populations as well as among whites, unquote. Now, I would like to extend these arguments by briefly discussing two important books just recently published, which present and discuss data related to aspects of the two major underlying themes of the declining significance of race. One book is by the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam, entitled Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. And the other is by the political scientists Marissa Arbajano and Zoltan Hojnal, entitled White Backlash, Immigration, Race, and American Politics. Putnam's book focuses on the changing relative importance of race and class in America, and Arbajano and Hojnal's book highlights the growing racial ethnic conflict in the political arena. I begin with a brief discussion of Putnam's book. According to Putnam, although racial barriers to success remain powerful, they represent less burdensome impediments than they did in the 1950s. By contrast, class barriers in America today, loom much larger than they did back then. This is reflected not only in growing income inequality among all racial and ethnic groups, as we saw in Figure 1, but also increasing disparities in many other aspects of well-being: accumulated wealth, class segregation across neighborhoods, quality of primary and secondary education, enrollment in highly selective colleges, and even life expectancy. Arbajano and Hojnal's book reveal that whereas in the past, individual policy preferences in the United States have been shaped at least at some point by antagonisms toward blacks, white Americans' mounting concerns about immigration have exacerbated the racial divide. The movement of white Americans, especially those in the South, from the Democratic to the Republican Party in the last several decades, in response to the civil rights movement, has recently accelerated due to concerns about immigration, especially Latino immigration. In other words, whereas in the past, racial tensions were typically driven by a black-white dynamic, Arbajano and Hojnal argued that this is less true today. The dynamics of race, they argued, have been fundamentally restructured by the increasing visibility of Latinos. Thus, they argue, whereas growing class inequality has become a characteristic feature of American life in general, the data that they present suggests that race has unseated class as the main dividing line in U.S. politics. Now, as I reflect on the powerful arguments in these two books, I conclude that the first underlying theme of the declining significance of race, the changing relative significance of race and class on one's life trajectory, has been extended to all U.S. racial and ethnic groups in Putnam's book. And Arbajano and Hojnal provide data on one increasingly important aspect of the second major underlying theme, the growing racial divide in politics. Now, what does this discussion suggest for the future of race relations in the United States? And as I think about this question, I am reminded of Richard Alba's, ALBA, Richard Alba's important book, Blurring the Color Line, which was published in 2009. Alba feels that it is a mistake, quote, to view our current ethno-racial inequalities as enduring, unquote. And his complex arguments in support of this view are based on his historical analysis of three conditions associated with the decisive mass-scale assimilation of Irish Catholics and the descendants of Southern and Eastern Europeans, as well as the rise of Asian Americans after World War II. And the first condition is what he calls non-zero-sum mobility. Non-zero-sum mobility, which occurs when the gains of lower status disadvantaged groups do not come at the expense of more advantaged groups. The second condition, which must work in tandem with non-zero-sum mobility, is the ability of less privileged groups to convert their socioeconomic advancement into social proximity with the dominant group, mainly through residential integration. Under such conditions, the children of less privileged groups are more able to gain access to spatially based resources, such as good schools, and develop the social skills, interracial or ethnic or interethnic friendships that contribute to success in mainstream settings when they reach adulthood. And the third condition is the emergence of a progressive ideology that effectively promotes equality of opportunity. Now, Alba envisions a similar unfolding of conditions in the 21st century that could effectively erode the rigid racial boundaries disadvantaging African Americans and Latinos. He argues that the retirement of the members of the massive baby boom generation, who are heavily white, well-educated, and hold a disproportionate number of the best-paying occupations, the retirement of this group could open up the labor market in a way that has not been true since the middle of the 20th century. Now, in this connection, we should be reminded that beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, the economy in the United States shifted from an industrial manufacturing-based system to a post-industrial economy defined by services and consumption. And this shift has resulted in what social scientists describe as an hourglass-shaped economy that we see today. An economy featuring many high-wage jobs at the top, many low-wage jobs at the bottom, but a spectacular loss of median-wage jobs in the middle. It is the growth of high-wage jobs at the top that is the focus of Alba's analysis. And Alba maintains that when we look across cohorts today, we see a greater penetration of African Americans and Hispanics entering the labor market into top decile and other top quartile positions. Because of this increased ethno-racial diversity near the top, many whites, he argues, now interact with minorities who are their peers in these positions. However, Despite the significance of non-zero-sum mobility for ethno-racial boundary change, there are certain contingencies that could change this scenario for African Americans and Hispanics in the next several decades. Contingencies that Alba carefully assesses in reaching his ultimate conclusion about the possibility of a more integrated America. And because of time constraints, I would like to only focus on two he mentioned. Mark, how am I doing by way of time? I'm going to wrap up soon. Am I okay? Huh? I'm on time? Okay, I'll be able to finish. It's not going to take much longer. The first thing that he talked about is that the United States, the first contingency, is that the United States could resort to recruiting trained immigrants from other countries to fill jobs opening up, requiring higher levels of qualifications. However, Alba proclaims that the United States will increasingly have to compete with other countries around the world for highly skilled immigrants, countries like Germany, Italy, and Spain, whose fertility levels have been well below job replacement levels in recent years. And the source of highly trained workers from foreign student populations will be limited in the United States due to the difficulties in obtaining student visas in the post-9/11 era, as well as the aggressive and increasingly successful recruitment of international students by European universities. Moreover, he argues, it is reasonable to expect that India and China could take steps to retain their highly skilled nationals if and when they reach certain points of economic development and demographic shift. Second, although non-zero-sum mobility would open up higher-paying positions that could be filled by people of color, the expansion of opportunities would enable white women and working-class white males to move into these positions in significantly higher numbers. However, Alba believes neither can satisfy the demand for highly skilled workers in the next several decades. The cohort of whites, he states, will come of age during the next 25 years, or let me put that, the cohort of whites, quote, that will come of age during the next 25 years are notably smaller than are the white baby boomers they will replace, unquote. And, quote, it would take something close to a revolution in the arrangements currently governing domestic life and the raising of children to unleash fully the working power of women, unquote. Nonetheless, the severest challenge to Alba's thesis remains, namely, the extent to which African Americans and Hispanics are able to take advantage of the opportunities for non-zero-sum mobility, given their lagging post-secondary educational attainments. Now, in addressing this problem, we should be reminded of the two other conditions that led to the relaxation of ethnic boundaries in the mid-20th century, and consider the likelihood that each, along with non-zero-sum mobility, could be reproduced in the next quarter century for less privileged groups of color. One, gaining access to spatially based resources, residential integration. Gaining access to spatially based resources such as good schools, through residential integration. And two, the emergence of a progressive ideology that effectively promotes equality of opportunity. Now, let me just focus briefly on the latter point, the progressive ideology. If non-zero-sum mobility does emerge in the next quarter century, the conditions associated with the removal of racial ethnic group competition would be favorable for the emergence and acceptance of a more progressive ideology of equality of opportunity as applied to Latinos, African Americans, and other groups of color. However, there is little reason to assume that African Americans will experience residential integration on a mass scale in the next few decades. Residential integration is crucial, Alba argues. Now, Alba is fully aware of the magnitude of the enduring problem stemming from racial segregation. He therefore calls for a greater national investment in education as well as effective programs of affirmative action. And let me first focus on the need for affirmative action in a period of non-zero-sum mobility. Research suggests that the white backlash against racial entitlements, such as affirmative action, contributed to the government's retreat from anti-discrimination policies during the Reagan administration of the 1980s afterwards, a retreat that may have influenced hiring and promotion decisions in the corporate sector as well. It should not be surprising that waning support for affirmative action programs would have an adverse effect on African Americans in particular. For example, a number of empirical studies have revealed significant differences in the family environment and neighborhood environment of blacks and whites that are understated when standard measures of socioeconomic status are employed, as I earlier remarks suggested. Take, for example, the question of family background. As we have shown, even white parents and black parents, even when white parents and black parents report the same average income, white parents have substantially more assets than do black parents. And as I also pointed out earlier, whites with the same amount of schooling as blacks usually attend better high schools and colleges. Furthermore, children's test scores are associated not only with the social and economic status of their parents, but also by the social and economic status of their grandparents. This means that it could take several generations before adjustments in socioeconomic inequality produce their full results. Thus, if we rely solely on the standard criteria for college admissions, for example, like SAT scores, even many children from black middle-income families would be denied admission in favor of middle-income whites who are not weighed down by the accumulation of disadvantages that stem from racial restrictions and who therefore tend to score higher on these conventional tests. For all these reasons, the success of younger educated blacks remains heavily dependent on affirmative action programs whereby more flexible criteria of evaluation is used to gauge potential to succeed. Now, Albert supports affirmative action. He's absolutely on the mark when he emphasizes the important role of affirmative action, and considering the fact that under conditions of non-zero-sum mobility, the advancement of trained and educated minorities is less threatening to the members of the dominant group because such mobility does not adversely affect their life chances. Affirmative action programs, especially those emphasizing flexible criteria of evaluation to gauge a person's potential to succeed, will be more readily accepted under those conditions. Now, the policy implications are obvious. Race-specific policies like affirmative action will be required for the foreseeable future, even under conditions of non-zero-sum mobility, to ensure the continued mobility of educated blacks. But affirmative action programs are not really designed to address the problems of the most disadvantaged and poorest people of color, especially those who live in impoverished inner-city ghettos. Accordingly, if we are beginning a period of non-zero-sum mobility, the minority individuals who are most likely to benefit will be those who are trained and educated, those who have the qualifications to enter the higher echelons of the labor market, whether directly or via affirmative action programs. Now, Alba recognizes that, and I quote him, the scenario of ethno-racial change coupled to non-zero-sum mobility will not help the minority poor very much, unquote. And that is why he called for greater investment in educational institutions and for programs that provide greater opportunity for occupational mobility in lieu of an effective long-range program of residential integration, so that more youngsters who have been raised in poor families and grown up in poor neighborhoods will improve their chances in life. Now, to his credit, he also recognizes that a reduction of such impoverishment will call for, quote, income redistribution through tax and welfare policies, and with greater public investment to improve communities where the poor reside and the institutions that serve them, unquote. But let me end by saying that for this foreseeable future, especially given the present political climate, only the most optimistic observers would anticipate that such a program would receive the necessary public and political support. Thus, if Alba's compelling arguments are indeed correct, the new chance for a more integrated America will largely apply to the more privileged people of color, not the minority poor. Thank you.
Well, my name is Mark Warren. I'm an associate professor of public policy and public affairs here at the McCormack Graduate School. It's an honor for me to welcome Bill Wilson here. I think you can tell from his remarks tonight and all of his work that he is someone who cares deeply about social justice, about low-income and poor families and their children, communities of color, and that, I believe, aligns so well with the mission of the McCormack Graduate School and why I'm happy to be part of that community. I think we know Bill as a tremendous intellectual, sharp social scientist, policy advocate. He is also, I'd like to say, a very warm and caring human being, someone who I think has been a generous supporter of younger scholars like myself who have tried to carry on the work of interrogating race and class and urban issues in this country, a generous supporter and also a warm friend to myself. So thank you, Bill, for coming and sharing your views with us tonight. I'm happy to moderate the next part of the conversation tonight. We're going to hear from 3 distinguished panelists for some remarks and some interchange with Bill. That will last for a little while, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from the floor. Your longer descriptions of our panelists as well as Bill and your program, but let me introduce Gail Lattimore. She is the Executive Director of the Common Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. She has over 32 years of experience in nonprofit management, and she has led the Common Square Neighborhood Development Corporation since 1998 as it's expanded its services to its neighbors and residents and built many units of affordable housing. Michael Patrick McDonald is the award-winning author of All Souls and many other books and publications. He grew up in the Old Colony Housing Project in South Boston, just down the road from here, and he's since become an activist for multicultural coalitions to reduce gun violence and build grassroots leadership. And then Daniel Rivera, on the end, is the mayor of Lawrence, Massachusetts, one of the only 4 Latino mayors in New England. He's born to a single mom who came from the Dominican Republic to find a better life for herself and her family. After military service in college, Mr. Rivera returned to manage the public housing project in which he grew up and eventually was elected mayor of the city. So I'm going to ask each of them to share some reflections or questions or comments from what they've heard from Bill, from each for maybe a minute or two, and then we'll see if Bill wants to respond and maybe do another round of that as well. So Gail.
So good evening, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So that was very sobering, you know, I certainly related to it from the perspective of, you know, class issues and just my own personal background with my parents who themselves migrated from the South during the 50s and didn't have a lot of education and emphasized for their 9 children, get an education. That's the way, you know, to make a difference in your life. And so all of us ended up going to college and moved into the middle class, so to speak. But I guess I come from this from the perspective of the low income and poor in terms of my work. We have a particular interest in Common Square in DC, which is a community development corporation in Dorchester, in serving low income people. Particularly, we have an initiative related to men of color, where we're trying to develop, to some extent, alternative economic models for them to kind of grow their economic resilience. And so I guess that's the issue that I wanted to, in the question, first of all, I wanted to ask Professor Wilson if he would, given how the title of the book leads people to certain conclusions, if you considered ever changing the title of your book. So that's the first question I wanted to put to him, because as I saw the title, and I've known of the professors and been in esteem and admiration of the professor's work, but don't pretend to have, you know, read everything that he's put forth, but did read the kind of summary that he did in the Daedalus, the journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences a couple of years ago. So I wondered if he would consider changing the title of the book. That's one thing. But the other thing, from the perspective of the low-income people that we serve, I wondered about the issue of kind of the geography of opportunity. And, you know, if the professor could speak to any knowledge he has about the various programs where you talk about kind of the spatial dynamics of opportunity, the various programs that I'm familiar with, not you know, well-versed in, but somewhat familiar with in terms of kind of moving, especially for the poor, moving folks to who are low income to communities that are not low income, particularly people of color who are living in subsidized housing. MECO, which is our kind of program in the school system here. I just wondered if you could speak to that, because it was a little disconcerting it's hard enough to think about folks who are middle class advancing, but for people who are low income, given the, what you said about, those two tools, the progressive ideology and the tools of education and affirmative action, and how difficult it will be to get political traction on those things anytime soon. I just wonder if you could speak to some of that spatial opportunity issues, if you've had any knowledge of some of those programs that have led to particularly low-income people advancing. And then just one final question that I had, which relates to some of the alternative economic models that we're trying to develop in Codman Square, particularly with men of color. We're doing things like having our men take control of land and creating urban agriculture that has the ability to grow healthy produce and actually get them involved in managing all aspects, not just tilling the soil, but creating business plans to do a cottage industry type out of that urban agriculture site. And so I just wondered if you could speak to just given the challenges of education kind of reform and affirmative action, what those opportunities are for low and moderate income men of color, or low income rather, men of color or people in general. Those are just some of the questions that I had, and I'll stop there.
Great. Michael.
Well, I come from a coalition building background, and in a lot of, louder? Okay. I come from a background of trying to build coalitions around all of the issues impacting poor people, coming from a neighborhood that at the time held the highest concentration of white poverty in America, with 3 contiguous census tracts that held 75% single-parent, female-headed households, and seeing the life expectancies there. In my own family, we lost, out of 11, 5 were dead or crippled, by the time they were in their early 20s. And I saw that with all of my neighbors as well. This would be in the lower end of South Boston, the housing projects and the areas around there, which were at the time white. And so when I became an activist in 1990 and a community organizer, I had to go across town where people were saying the words that we couldn't say in my neighborhood, words like crime, violence, poverty, drugs, and so forth. We had a strict code of silence around that stuff. But some of it was imposed by organized crime, but also some of it came from the tendency for poor white people to kind of try to forget about this poor thing and maybe sneak into the white thing. So there was a lot of denial, of course, around these issues, and the denial and was reinforced by the racism, and the racism reinforced the denial. And more of our young people died throughout those years. So when I became an activist and a community organizer, I was mostly working in communities of color in Boston, where I learned what it meant to be a community organizer. I mean, to say that, to even name community organizing, you'd be chased out of town as a communist in South Boston. And then eventually to bring that stuff back home to South Boston, but also to try to build coalitions and always wanting to include. Whenever I was doing this kind of work around the city of Boston, we were always saying we were building multicultural coalitions to reduce this, that, and the other thing, right? And around the table were never white people who came from where I came from. So it tended to be upper middle class and wealthier white liberal people and people of color, many of whom would have come from poor and working class backgrounds. So when I was getting into that world of citywide organizing, I knew that we needed to include people from Southie and Charlestown, the 2 neighborhoods that had people like my family. So that became my goal, and the bane of my existence was always around this whole issue of white flight to the Republican Party that was brought up here. So and that was a national phenomenon, but in Boston, that was even more extreme. In the years following desegregation and busing in Boston, we saw that neighborhoods that were overwhelmingly Democratic voters. Charlestown and Southie became overwhelming Republican voters as well. So it was part of the national phenomenon, I think, that we were seeing, but also was Ronald Formazano showed in his book the charts that showed that the difference before and after busing. So that flight and that resistance to identify as poor and that resistance to progressive movements has always been something that I've been working against, and have done a lot of work since then with populations from South Boston and Charlestown, and actually found it was pretty easy to get people involved in this stuff and to care about all of these issues that impact all poor people, but always disproportionately impact poor people of color. It wasn't that hard to get these populations involved in these movements locally, and the reason I found was that the thing that people had most in common was, again, our neighborhood was 75% single-parent, female-headed households. Orchard Park Project was probably around the same statistics. In the early 80s, the City of Boston's Department of Public Health, Howard Spivak, Deborah Prothero-Stith were creating the Violence Prevention Project in Boston, and they matched up Roxbury and Southie because as much as Southie was denying it at the time, they had the same stats on everything. And I think that the gender aspect is a hugely important part of that. And in doing coalition building work, I found that was the key. When mothers of murdered children from Charlestown met mothers of murdered children from Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, they were immediately sisters. They had been through the worst possible thing that any human being can ever experience on this earth, the loss of a child violently and young. And then in more recent years, we've had huge drug epidemics. Not only, South Boston now is a really changed place with gentrification, but we have a diaspora now. Our population has been pushed out to the lower rent suburbs, and I haven't seen a big change in the outcomes of people's lives, especially looking at the heroin-related deaths, which is close to 85% a white situation in Eastern Mass, which has the worst epidemic nationally. So trying to bring my whole goal now is to continue to do this kind of work. Geographically, it's become more difficult because we've been flung to the four winds, and so are Black and Latino communities now. But interestingly enough, those single-parent, female-headed households that are in places like Malden and parts of Quincy and so forth, they're kind of diverse, and that's kind of a new, interesting phenomenon. So just from a coalition building perspective, I'm looking at the possibilities, given so many of the changes, given the suburbanization of poverty, given that it's so much more dispersed now than it was in these highly concentrated urban neighborhoods. So just thoughts around that I would love to hear. And thank you so much for all of your work, and I'm a huge fan and honored to be here.
Thank you. Okay, Dan.
Good evening, and thank you all for sticking around and coming out to hear us and the professor. I come to this as a student of government, and one of my very first important government lesson I learned, I was a private in the United States Army, and I was stationed in Germany. I turned on the TV, waiting to see whether or not they were going to call my unit to go to Desert Storm, and it wasn't Norman Schwarzkopf, and it wasn't any man or woman in uniform that came out and called our unit going to Saudi Arabia to begin Desert Shield before Desert Storm. It was an appointed official for the then president. And I thought, you know what, it's really important for people of color to become either elected officials because the immediate impact of their decisions were happening right up to me. So when I came home, having already been a kid, kind of the poster child for democratic politics, public schools, public housing, the GI Bill, Pell Grants, and the GI Bill to get my first home. I mean, this is the thing that I really want to continue to fight for and hope that, we can get to that more optimistic space where there is more funding for some of these things you talked about, although I have an idea about that. But to be the only person maybe up here to say that my community, when you're a person of color who is the mayor of a majority minority community, there is a declining significance of race. But to the point where we're trying to manage this discussion about these things, we've changed kind of the words we use. So we don't, a lot of people like to come and tell us how many people of color we have in our city, and I tell them, like, that's nothing new. You can just walk around. People would notice that. The question we started to ask is, how many people do we have of foreign born? Because if you know anything about Lawrence, Lawrence has been an immigrant community, will always be an immigrant community. And it's such a unifying thing to say to an 85-year-old Irish woman who wants to vote against you because you want to let the Hispanic community have an X thing downtown, do something. When you say to her, just like we're an immigrant community. And before the Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, it was the Irish and the Polish and the Italians. And they beam about that. And there's a sense of pride, like, hey, we do have this continuum. And folks in the Hispanic community doesn't really like that. I say, and you know, next to the Guatemalans, and after that might be the Northern Africans and Eastern European. It's just this big struggle. So we do this conversation around foreign born, and some people fight it because it's better to say, you know, the numbers of Latinos are so much. But in order to have that harmony, I think it's crucial for us to talk about it like that. I do want to know whether, so first, the increasing in ed dollars. Lawrence is a school that's been taken over by the state, and we're finding some success in a lot of places along the way. We're doing a really good job, and I think that has to do with who they chose to be the overseer of the takeover, as well as the manner in which they went about doing the turnaround plan in Lawrence, and that was basically there wasn't mass firings or threats of mass firings. It was a really consensus building process. The review process for teachers was really rough on people, and a lot of people would rather not have that happen again. Same thing happened to principals. So it was a vetting of sorts, but it was inclusive and people were part of it. But I think that conversation and this thing that the people are all attracted to, both Republicans and Democrats, about shrinking the achievement gap is hopeful to me, because it's something that I've heard the new governor talk about. He's not talking about early childhood education, but he is talking about the achievement gap, and he wants to do what they're doing in Lawrence. So in that space where they're trying to grow that, where do we put money to impact poverty? He's also getting behind some stuff with, and I don't want to be a show for Charlie Baker, I'm just saying that this is it's stuff that's important in our community. For SSYI program, a program heralded by the former governor, Safe Streets Youth Initiative, another thing that he's going to continue in that. And again, this is the conversation we see happening in Massachusetts. But so hopefully, even though we had a progressive ed reform law to begin with, we can continue that, Dr. Wilson, in that there will be more funds put out, and we're surrounded by communities of more wealth in Lawrence, and their willingness to see that happening and their support of Lawrence Public Schools doing better says to me, maybe if they go to vote one day for some type of tax increase that will impact education, that they won't have the same reaction they did for the tax increase on the beer. They got actually soundly returned the next month or so. And the last thing I'll tell you is I do have a question. As I was listening to you about flexible criteria for entrance into college education as a way of affirmative action, why call it affirmative action? So that, and I don't want to hide from what we're trying to do. I'm just saying that if that's the thing that turns people off, let's just say we're going to have flexible criteria for college entrance into education, college and high school, not only for students of color, but for students with learning disabilities and the like. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So Bill, you don't have to respond to everything that was raised, but maybe there's a few of these issues you'd like to respond to.
So these are all very thoughtful comments. Let me begin with Mayor Rivera's question about why use the concept affirmative action. It's a very good question. When I was informal advisor to President Clinton, I would send him emails. And believe it or not, he would respond with handwritten notes to my comments. It was absolutely amazing. And I suggested to him Mr. Mayor, that rather than use the word affirmative action, why don't you use the term affirmative opportunity? Because that will resonate more with the American public, because the sense is that you're helping people to help themselves. And flexible criteria of evaluation sort of fits in with that. So I think one of the reasons why the Supreme Court did not rule against the Michigan Law School. They ruled against the undergraduate Michigan program because the undergraduate program used ratings. And so using sort of ratings, numerical guidelines, and so on, whereas the law school used flexible criteria of evaluation to gauge a candidate's potential to succeed, recognizing that some people do better on different kinds of criteria than others. The Supreme Court upheld that in a ruling 5-4. But I really agree with you that it would be better to use the term affirmative opportunity rather than affirmative action. And by the way, in this connection, whereas Americans are overwhelmingly against quotas and numerical guidelines which they associate with affirmative action, if you ask them, would you support a program to provide scholarships, college scholarships, to students of color, I think the question was, to black kids who maintain good grades in school? An overwhelming majority of white Americans supported that, see, because it's helping people to help themselves, which resonates with the American people. Now, and Gil Lattimore, you raised some really interesting questions. First one, why use the term declining significance of race? Titles are very important. I've always used great titles. The declining significance of race, the truly disadvantaged, when work disappears, there goes the neighborhood. You know, I just take time, you know. So I went back and forth on this title. And then one day, 2 o'clock in the morning in a hotel room in New York, the thought hit me, the declining significance of race. Liberals will read it to find out, what is this fool talking about? Conservatives will read it because, oh, we finally got someone who's saying something. But really, seriously, the main reason why I thought about the increasing significance of class, but the main reason is that there are two themes of the declining significance of race. The first one is that economic class has become more important than race in determining an individual's life trajectory. The second one was that the center of racial conflict had shifted from the economic sector to the social political order. The increasing significance of class does not capture that second theme. So that's one of the reasons I went. Now, your question about, you know, what kinds of programs should we be talking about to address the people that you work with? I've given this some thought. There are national programs that we could think about, and there are local programs. One national program that I would like to see would be targeting municipalities or areas that have the highest unemployment rates around the country, with services including public sector employment for individuals who cannot find work in the private sector, and also providing employers with incentives to hire disadvantaged people in their area. Now, Congressman George Miller introduced a bill in the House in 2010. I think I've forgotten what the name was, something like Jobs for America, which he called for a program like that. Unfortunately, and not surprisingly, it never got through Congress. But there are, local programs that I would love to see. For example, the Harlem Children's Zone. Jeffrey Canada created the Harlem Children's Zone. And by the way, he told me that my book, The Truly Disadvantaged, influenced him in thinking about how to deal with how to address the problem of concentrated poverty in his area. For those of you who don't know, the Harlem Children's Zone is a program centered in central Harlem, which has flooded a group of blocks in central Harlem with all kinds of resources, economic resources, medical resources, social resources, educational resources that would create a comprehensive safety net for the children in the area. And that program impressed President Obama so much that he created, the promised neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the original budget was severely undercut. The promised neighborhoods were modeled, patterned after the Harlem Children's Zone. Severely cut. What he has provided is $300,000 to $500,000 to 20 cities that competed for these grants. These are planning grants that they can hopefully use when there's more money available for a full, comprehensive program. I don't want to go on too long, but those are just right. So I was listening to Michael's comments about coalition building, and Michael, I wrote a book entitled "The Bridge Over the Racial Divide," published in 1999. The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, Rising Inequality and Coalition Politics. And I drew heavily on Mark's work in one chapter where he talks about Ernesto Cortez and, oh geez, I'm blocking on the name of his, help me out, Industrial Areas Foundation, which is a coalition of religious leaders really addressing poverty in various communities around the country, particularly the most successful ones are in Texas. And when I looked at some of these programs, one thing that struck me was that they satisfy the condition of, what is the condition I wanted to talk about? Interdependence. Interdependence, where groups come to feel that they can accomplish their goals without the support of other groups. If you can generate a sense of interdependence, it's the first major step toward getting a coalition off the ground. And certainly it's important for sustaining a coalition. I'm sure you're fully aware of that.
All right, thank you. I know we've run quite a bit over, so I guess we're not going to take any questions from the audience then at this point?
Excuse me, let me step up. I'm Bob Turner. I'm the chairman of the committee that put this together. And really, we look forward to the questions from the audience, but we're running so far over time. I think we better plan next year to go 3 or 4 hours instead of 2, because there's so much material to talk about here. But thank you all for coming out. Let me just say very quickly a couple of things. One is a question that I know at least one person here is very eager to know. The Celtics are now ahead 48-44.
Oh, see, you know something? I am a Celtics fan. Man, believe me, it was hard for me.
So now, that's not the only reason. But very quickly, thank you to Ira for such dynamic leadership at the McCormack School. Thank you to all the members of the committee, those of you who are still here, most of all Peggy, who is just a delight to meet with a few times. To all of you who came out to the panel, we look forward to seeing you again, and particularly to Professor Wilson and to Mark for bringing him here. And I'll just close by saying, inspired a little bit by Governor Hassan, that I think it's important to dream. We all need to have dreams, but dreams don't get you very far unless you think as well. And where else but the Academy brings together thought and dreaming as much as here. And I think we've certainly had a good dose of both today. Thank you all for coming.